Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now recently I've seen a video doing the rounds on social media that originated from TikTok where somebody by the name Q World, armed with a plastic spoon and some paper plates, is going to attempt to show the moon landings were faked. Now, he's going to bring up a few points in this video, all of which are fairly fundamental, basic parts of the moon landings. So I know some people out there will say that debunking this is softballing things rather than addressing more complex arguments about the moon landings. However, the things that Q-Worlds asks in this video are all points that I've had asked in my comments dozens of times over. So these are clearly concepts that people can't wrap their head around, and if they're stuck on these parts, then they will really struggle with the other arguments. So I'm hoping that addressing this will sort of move the conversation along, because, like I said, a lot of this is fairly basic parts of orbital mechanics. For example, his first point about how they launch a rocket to the moon.
Let's just say this table is Earth, right? Everybody got into the rocket and they took off, going 6,000 miles per hour. And eventually, after they got out of Earth's atmosphere, they went 24,000 miles per hour. And somehow they slowed down and landed on the moon safely.
Rockets don't just launch straight up to space, because even in space, Earth's gravity is still acting on things. So if a rocket went straight up, then once its engine stopped, its speed in relation to Earth would begin to reduce, eventually reaching zero, and then it would just fall back to Earth. Same as if you fired a gun straight up in the air. The bullet would fly up and then would fall back and land where it started. Instead, rockets need to launch into an orbit. So they launch up, but then begin a gradual pitch over, more like if you fired a gun on an angle. The bullet would still travel up initially, but it would also be traveling across Earth's surface. And an orbit is simply where the sideways movement is fast enough that the effect of gravity matches the curvature rate. So the rocket is essentially falling back to Earth, but always missing. At first, the pitch over is quite slight because the rocket is climbing up through dense air. Once it's up into the thinner air where there's less drag, then the pitch over increases further. This then starts to shift the thrust from pushing the rocket up and instead more pushing it across. Now, it's probably around this point a lot of people are readying to type the same sort of messages that I receive a lot, saying these people just need to play Kerbal Space Program and then they'll understand it. Now, I do agree with the sentiment, however, Kerbal Space has a very steep learning curve, even if you're already familiar with these topics, and it has to be played on either a computer or a games console. So for a complete beginner, it's probably not the best choice. I personally would recommend trying out Spaceflight Simulator. It still lays out the concepts of the topic and lets you play around with them without overcomplicating things. It's visual, so it's easy to understand. You can play it on mobile, and it has a very user-friendly interface. Which, funnily enough, are all the same ways I would describe today's sponsor, Brilliant.org. They have a huge range of online courses with topics to improve everything from your scientific thinking and logic through to understanding modern technology and learning how to code. I personally find the learning is much more effective thanks to their use of interactive animations that makes the topics more visual and engaging. Even just a few minutes a day can help keep your brain in tip-top condition. I'll usually get a class done while I'm waiting for the kids to finish their activities. In fact, regular viewers will attest I've been a long-time user of Brilliant. My daily streak of completing classes has now reached over 1,040 consecutive days. But don't just take my word for it. Try it for yourself absolutely free by grabbing a 30-day free trial using my link brilliant.org/Dave McKeegan. And if you enjoy it as much as I do, then that link will also get you 20% off their annual subscription. Now, back to launching rockets. So, no, the rockets didn't just fly straight up and to the moon. They launched into an orbit first. Now, an orbit has an apogee and a perigee. Apogee is the farthest distance from Earth, perigee is the closest distance. About 2 hours after reaching orbit, they performed the translunar injection burn, which raised their apogee out to a distance that would allow them to reach the moon. The speed required for this was around 24,000 miles an hour.
24,000 miles per hour, and somehow they slowed down and landed on the moon safely. In the midst of that, they didn't hit no satellites because, we got like 10 or 15,000 of them in the sky.
I've heard a lot of people talk as though they needed to burn the engines to slow down from 24,000 miles an hour when they reach the moon, which isn't how orbits work. If we consider a regular orbit without the moon for now, using Spaceflight Simulator, you can see if the spacecraft is in a perfectly circular orbit around Earth, then its velocity stays constant. However, if you increase the apogee, you have to first speed up. But from that point on, you are now traveling away from Earth, not so much around the Earth. So Earth's gravity is slowing you down, which eventually stops you traveling away from the Earth and starts you accelerating back towards the Earth. If Earth's gravity wasn't a factor, then you would just travel in a straight line away from Earth at a constant speed. Earth's gravity is the reason the orbits remain oval. So your speed increases as you approach Earth, but your orbit path is going to miss Earth and its gravity is going to slingshot you back around again. And the highest velocity you will reach is right at perigee, when you stop traveling towards the Earth and start again traveling away from it. So now, if we put the moon where our apogee is, as soon as the TLI burn is finished, the engines are shut down and the spacecraft's velocity is going to naturally start decreasing. And by the very nature of having apogee near the moon, it means that the speed at which it is traveling away from Earth is naturally going to reach zero around the time it gets to the moon. The analogy I like to imagine this is if you're standing at the base of a building and you have a friend in a window of an upper floor and you want to throw something up to them. You accelerate that object away from you, just like a TLI burn. From the moment you release that object, Earth's gravity is now slowing it down. Now, you want it to reach your friend, in this instance, the moon. If you don't propel it enough, then it will stop and fall back to you before it gets there. Too much force and it will fly straight past them. But if you give just the right amount of force, it will naturally reach a stop right by your friend. That is the basic concept of how to fly to the moon. It's obviously more complicated than that in reality because the moon has its own gravity, so as the spacecraft nears it, it will then start to speed back up again, but nowhere near as much as Earth will, so you won't get to 24,000 miles an hour. And they don't want to aim directly for the moon and immediately descend. Instead, they want to put themselves into an orbit around the moon first. So they fly near to the moon, and as they reach the closest distance to the moon, they do a short burn to slow themselves down and put them in a circular orbit rather than flying back towards Earth.
In the midst of that, they didn't hit no satellites because, we got like 10 or 15,000 of them in the sky.
Yes, there's around 15,000 satellites in orbit now, but there was nowhere near that number back during Apollo. But the idea of hitting a satellite, because there's 15,000 of them up there, is a bit narrow-minded, because most of those satellites are in an altitude range between 100 miles to 1,200 miles, or 160 to 2,000 kilometers. At any given moment on Earth, there's around 15,000 planes in the air, most of those occupying a region between 30 to 40,000 feet in altitude. And yet, how often does a rocket launch ever hit a plane?
No GPS back then, no cell phones, no geolocation. Like, they just, they got there safely.
No, they didn't have GPS or geolocation in the sense that we're used to these days, with satellites being used to get a position fix. However, the spacecraft's position was tracked from Earth thanks to a network of tracking stations that could constantly remain in contact with the craft. For example, this is the tracked path of Apollo 11 whilst it was in orbit around Earth. But also, the astronauts had the ability to know their own position without the help of people back on Earth, thanks to the onboard inertial guidance computer. They even had optical sextants built into the spacecraft hull, which they could use to align themselves and calibrate the guidance computer. And whilst the idea of travelling to the moon might seem very complex and people think it requires an insane amount of computing power by today's standards, it's actually fairly straightforward in principle. Given that the moon is in a stable, predictable orbit around Earth, the rate of deceleration of the spacecraft experiences when coasting to the moon is straightforward to calculate, so engineers could fairly easily work out how long it would take to coast to the moon from a given initial burn speed. Meaning they know where the moon will be at that particular moment in time, so all they then have to do is conduct the TLI burn on the opposite side of the Earth to where the moon is going to be in 3 days' time, and that will send the spacecraft into the vicinity of moon's gravity. And that is if it was just a dumb, unguided payload. With constant monitoring and them having the ability to adjust their path through the use of mid-course correction burns, getting to an exact region of the moon is entirely possible without the insanely powered computers of today. Just like how pilots for decades have been able to accurately navigate around the globe with guidance systems far less advanced than what was used on Apollo.
Okay, boom, they land. They get out, they stab the flag, they take pictures, and also somehow, some way, they also recorded the landing on the moon. Even though Neil Armstrong was the first person to get there, how did they get the recording of him? So we're not even going to go there.
The only recordings of the Apollo landings were ones taken from onboard the lunar module, looking out of the right-hand side window. But this wasn't a TV camera, this was the 16mm film camera, the footage of which wasn't viewed until after it was returned to Earth. There was never any external recordings of the landings as he's claiming here, which actually links to a claim I've seen people make about a Buzz Aldrin interview.
I remember very clearly, I think anybody who was alive at the time does, I remember my parents waking me up and we went down and we watched you guys land on the moon.
No, you didn't.
What?
Because there wasn't any television. There wasn't anybody taking a picture. You watched animation.
Now, people take this to mean that Buzz is admitting they didn't land on the moon, when in actuality, what he's saying is Conan couldn't have watched them actually landing on the moon because there was no TV broadcast running during the actual landing, only radio transmissions that were being broadcast. But obviously, the news stations that were covering this wanted something to show their audience, and since they knew well in advance that the landings were going to be happening, they created rudimentary animations to demonstrate what was going on. Nothing was actually a live view until Armstrong exited the lunar module and released the compartment door of the descent stage, which had a TV camera mounted upside down on the inside. So when the door was opened, it pointed the camera towards the lunar module ladder to give a view of Armstrong coming down it.
Now, just follow me here. So now this is the moon, okay? They're on the moon now, right? The flag is planted. They took the pictures. They got the recordings. And they got the phone call in the 60s from the White House to the moon.
I love this claim. So many people comment thinking that President Nixon literally picked up a landline phone and dialed the moon, when in actuality he just called Mission Control in Houston, who were already in radio contact with the astronauts, and they just patched Nixon's phone call into the radio systems to allow him to speak to the astronauts. Just like how you can be driving in your car and listening to the radio, and you can hear someone call into the radio station from a landline phone. They've not dialed your car directly.
Now, I can't even make a phone call from this basement I'm in to my house, let alone from the White House to the moon. Remind you, that's 238,000 miles away.
And again, people talk about the difficulties with phone calls today, except everyone these days is on a mobile phone. Mobiles have small antennas inside them which don't know what direction the cell tower's in, so they broadcast signals in all directions. Even the towers themselves are transmitting a fairly wide field signal, and they're dealing with signals from lots of devices simultaneously, rather than needing a separate antenna aiming at each phone. And rarely do you have a clear line of sight to the tower. There's normally obstacles like buildings getting in the way. For the mission to the moon, NASA used dedicated tracking stations which had huge dishes that were pointing directly at the moon, and the lunar module itself had a radio antenna on the top of it which could be turned so they aimed it pointing directly at Earth. And that entire system was dedicated solely to the data being transmitted to and from the astronauts in Houston.
They're on the moon, they gather all their belongings, and they start to head back to Earth. Remind you, technology was not what it is today, okay? I want to know what type of technology would you had to have to actually alter direction. So, you got to go 6,000 miles fast, right? To get speed. So you boom, blast off. Now, how did you change direction and just start aiming to Earth? Like, at what point, like, what type of technology was out there at that point where you were able to, or did you, like, aim the rocket? Did you have something already there that could, like, aim the rocket directly at Earth and, like, hit the exact target of where you want to go?
Leaving the moon was very much like leaving Earth. They didn't just fly straight up and head for Earth. They launched into orbit around the moon. So they lifted off and pitched over to head in the same direction as the CSM that had stayed in orbit whilst they were on the moon. They rendezvoused with each other before then discarding the lunar module and heading back to Earth in just the command service module. As for the technology to change direction, though, there's two ways that they did this. Both had the same basic concept. You direct the thrust from the main engine. So on liftoff, large rockets can pitch over because their engines are gimbaled, which allows them to pivot slightly. This changes the direction that the thrust is pushing against the rocket, which then causes the rocket to turn as a result. For things like the lunar module, whilst the descent stage that they used to land on the moon could be gimbaled, the ascent stage to get back into orbit couldn't. That was fixed rigid to the lunar module. Instead, to change the pitch of the whole ascent stage, the RCS thrusters would fire. So if the front pair of thrusters fired upwards and the rear pair fired downwards, this would pitch the lunar module forward. If the right-hand pair thrust down and the left-hand pair thrusted up, then the whole thing would roll to the left. So no crazy technology required, just knowledge from a lot of very smart scientists and engineers who'd been developing all of this over several years during the Gemini program and the unmanned landers which was sent to the moon before Apollo. And that is going to be it for today. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.